Elijah Novak never expected his life to change during that chaotic night shift at Riverstone Memorial. Drowning in his brother's medical bills and working double shifts just to stay afloat, compassion was the only thing he had left to give. When the disheveled man was wheeled in, ignored by other staff, treated like he was invisible, Elijah did what came naturally. He showed kindness. He offered dignity. He shared his last protein bar and talked about the stars with a stranger everyone else had written off. 3 months later, that same man walked into his hospital wearing a tailored suit worth more than Elijah's annual salary. Sebastian Thorne, tech billionaire and one of the richest men in the country, had been conducting a social experiment that night. Now he was back with an offer that made Elijah's heart stop: marriage. A convenient arrangement that would save Elijah's brother and satisfy Sebastian's inheritance clause. What starts as a business proposition quickly becomes complicated. The touch of Sebastian's hand during a thunderstorm. The way his eyes softened when visiting Theo in the care facility. The kiss that was supposed to be practice but felt anything but fake. Just as Elijah begins to hope their arrangement might be turning real, Sebastian's ex appears at their engagement party with devastating news. Can love that begins as a transaction ever become authentic? Or is Elijah just another experiment to a man who can buy anything except genuine connection? Before we start the video, buckle up, get ready and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. The fluorescent lights of Riverstone Memorial's emergency room flickered, casting harsh shadows across Elijah Novak's tired face as he checked the vitals of an elderly woman with pneumonia. 20 hours into what should have been a 12-hour shift, his muscles ached with fatigue, but his hands remained steady. The same couldn't be said for his bank account or his brother's health. "Your oxygen levels are looking better, Mrs. Patterson," Elijah said, adjusting her nasal cannula with gentle fingers. "Think you might be ready for some soup." The woman's grateful smile momentarily lightened the weight pressing down on his shoulders, the weight of overdue rent, mounting medical bills, and the knowledge that his younger brother, Theo, needed another round of experimental treatments that insurance had already denied. Twice. Novak. Vanessa called from the nurse's station, her voice sharp with impatience. "Ambulance incoming, 5 minutes out." Elijah squeezed Mrs. Patterson's hand. "I'll check on you later. Promise." He moved through the ER with practiced efficiency, his faded blue scrubs hanging loose on his frame after months of skipping meals to save money. The past year had whittled him down, chipping away at everything except the core of compassion that had drawn him to nursing in the first place. The ambulance bay doors slid open. Paramedics wheeled in a gurney carrying a disheveled man with a matted beard and the unmistakable smell of someone who hadn't seen running water in weeks. Vanessa's nose wrinkled visibly as she accepted the handoff report. Possible dehydration, found collapsed at the bus stop on Maple. No ID, no insurance. She passed the clipboard to Elijah, with barely concealed distaste. "He's all yours. I'm due for break." Elijah watched her retreat, then turned to the patient. Beneath the dirt and worn clothing, he noticed surprisingly clear eyes watching him intently. "I'm Elijah, one of the nurses who will be taking care of you tonight. Can you tell me your name?" "Thomas," the man replied, his articulation surprisingly precise. "Thomas Wright." Elijah guided the gurney to a curtained area, noting the contrast between the man's speech and appearance. His hands, though dirty, showed no calluses typical of long-term homelessness. Something didn't quite fit, but Elijah had learned long ago not to judge patients by appearances. "Let's get you more comfortable, Mr. Wright. I'm going to check your vitals and then we'll see about getting you some fluids." As Elijah worked, Thomas watched him with unexpected intensity. "Most people see the dirt first," he observed quietly. "You looked at my eyes." Elijah smiled as he wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Thomas' arm. "Eyes tell you more than clothes ever could." 3 hours later, with Thomas stabilized and dozing, Elijah slipped him the protein bar he'd brought for his own dinner. The lab results had confirmed severe dehydration but little else. The attending physician had already authorized discharge once the IV fluids were complete, typical for non-emergency cases without insurance. "You should eat that yourself," Thomas said, startling Elijah. "You look like you need it more than I do." "I can grab something from the cafeteria later," Elijah lied, pressing the bar into the man's hand. "Please." Thomas accepted with curious hesitation. "Why nursing?" he asked, unwrapping the bar methodically. Elijah checked the IV line, buying time as he considered how much to share with a stranger. "My parents were in a car accident when I was 16. My brother Theo was 14. The nurses at the hospital where my parents died showed me that compassion could exist in even the darkest moments. And now you're that compassion for others, Thomas observed. I try to be, Elijah said, suddenly uncomfortable with the man's perceptiveness. He changed the subject. You have somewhere to go tonight when we discharge you? Thomas' expression shifted subtly. I'll manage. When Dr. Sanders signed the discharge papers an hour later, Elijah provided Thomas with information about local shelters and a spare pair of socks from his locker. As he watched the man walk slowly toward the exit, Elijah felt the familiar pang of sending someone back to uncertainty, knowing the healthcare system had addressed only the immediate symptom rather than the underlying condition. Bleeding heart, Vanessa remarked when she returned. One of these days you'll learn you can't save everyone, Novak. Elijah didn't argue. He simply moved on to the next patient, then the next and the next, until dawn broke and his extended shift finally ended. The care facility where Theo lived was already bustling with morning activity when Elijah arrived. His brother's room was at the end of the hall, the smallest single room, but Elijah had fought hard to ensure Theo had privacy, knowing how much his proud, fiercely independent brother hated feeling exposed during his worst moments. Morning superhero, Elijah called softly from the doorway. Theo looked up from his book, his smile transforming a face gone from years of aggressive treatments. At 24, he appeared a decade older, his body betraying him while his mind remained sharp as ever. You look terrible, Theo observed, setting aside his worn paperback. Double shift again. Triple, Elijah admitted, sinking into the chair beside the bed. But Mrs. Winters brought homemade cookies to the nurse's station, so worth it. The lie came easily after years of practice. Better than admitting he'd picked up extra hours, because the facility's administrator had pulled him aside last week, with gentle but firm warnings about their payment situation. Liar, Theo said without heat. You forget I lived with you for 18 years. I know your everything is fine face. Before Elijah could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Diana Evans, the facility's administrative director. Her sympathetic smile did nothing to mask the purpose of her visit. Mr. Novak, could I speak with you for a moment? In the hallway, Diana kept her voice low. Elijah, I've stretched every policy I can. The board is asking questions about Theo's account. We need at least partial payment by the end of the month. I know, Elijah said, fighting to keep his voice steady. I'm working on it. I'll pick up extra shifts, and there's a research trial opening in Mercer that might cover some of his treatment costs. Diana's expression made it clear she'd heard similar promises before. End of the month, Elijah. After that, we'll need to discuss transfer options to a state facility. The words knocked the air from his lungs. State facilities lacked the specialized care Theo needed. His brother's chances would plummet. It won't come to that, Elijah promised, more to himself than to Diana. Back in his apartment that evening, Elijah sorted through the stack of bills that had accumulated during his extended shift. Electricity past due. Rent due in 3 days. The denial letter from Theo's insurance company regarding the experimental treatment that might actually put his condition into remission. His phone rang, displaying a name he hadn't seen in months. Ryan Chambers, his ex. Against his better judgment, Elijah answered. Well, if it isn't Florence Nightingale, Ryan's voice carried the slight slur of expensive whiskey. Saw your brother's fundraising page online. Still playing the martyr, I see. Elijah closed his eyes, regretting the moment of weakness that had led him to answer. What do you want, Ryan? Just checking in. My new boyfriend just closed a 7-figure deal. We're celebrating on his yacht. The emphasis on yacht wasn't subtle. Remember when I said you were making a mistake choosing your brother's medical bills over our relationship? Still stand by that assessment. Goodbye, Ryan. Wait, I was actually calling because George feels bad about your situation. He'd be willing to help with a donation. Small one, of course. Consider it charity. The word charity burned like acid. No, thank you, Elijah replied, his voice tight. I'm glad you found someone with both money and compassion. Good night. He ended the call before Ryan could respond, then sank onto his worn sofa, head in his hands. 3 more shifts were already scheduled for tomorrow. It still wouldn't be enough. 3 weeks later, Elijah was summoned to the hospital administrator's office. His mind had raced through possible infractions. Had he made a medication error in his exhaustion? Had a patient complained? When he pushed open the heavy door, he froze. Sitting across from Administrator Jacobs was a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his beard now neatly trimmed, his posture exuding quiet authority. Despite the transformation, Elijah recognized those observant eyes immediately. Mr. Novak, Jacobs said, rising. This gentleman has requested to speak with you privately. I'll give you the room." As the door closed behind Jacobs, Elijah remained standing, confusion warring with recognition. "Thomas." The man smiled, extending his hand. "Sebastian Thorne, actually. Please, sit. I believe we have much to discuss." Elijah sank into the chair across from Sebastian, acutely aware of his wrinkled scrubs and the dark circles under his eyes. The office suddenly felt too small, the air charged with an inexplicable tension. "You're not homeless," Elijah stated, his mind still processing the transformation before him. Sebastian's lips curved into a slight smile. "Not in the conventional sense, no." Was it some kind of joke, pretending to be destitute? Anger flared briefly in Elijah's chest. "Do you have any idea how many genuinely homeless patients we turn away every day because we lack resources?" "It wasn't a joke," Sebastian replied, his expression sobering. "It was a social experiment. I wanted to experience our healthcare system without the filter of privilege." He leaned forward slightly. "Well, I didn't expect it was you." Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything special." "But he did." Sebastian's gaze was disconcertingly direct. "You treated Thomas with the same dignity you would give any other patient. You shared your dinner. You looked me in the eyes when everyone else saw only dirt." Elijah's discomfort grew. He hadn't done anything worthy of this level of attention. Certainly nothing that warranted a private meeting with a man who was clearly powerful enough to command the hospital administrator's immediate cooperation. "Mr. Thorne, while I appreciate the feedback, I should really get back to my patients." "Sebastian, please." He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a business card, sliding it across the desk. "I'm the founder and CEO of Nexus Technologies." Elijah glanced at the card, recognition dawning. Nexus Technologies was a global telecommunications giant, its logo emblazoned across billboards throughout the city. The man sitting across from him wasn't just wealthy, he was stratospheric. "I've been researching you, Elijah, your work ethic, your dedication to your brother, the situation with his medical care." Elijah stiffened. "My family's medical situation is private." Of course, Sebastian nodded, acknowledging the boundary. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I'd like to help. I want to cover your brother's medical expenses, all of them, past and future." The offer hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Elijah could only stare in disbelief. When he finally found his voice, it emerged strangled with suspicion. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." Sebastian's expression remained carefully composed. "Consider it repayment for a kindness freely given." "I can't accept charity," Elijah said automatically, the word bringing back the sting of Ryan's condescension. "Then perhaps you'll consider an arrangement that benefits us both." Sebastian folded his hands on the desk. "I need a spouse, Elijah." Elijah blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "My grandfather's will contain a marriage clause. To access certain family holdings crucial for Nexus's next expansion phase, I need to be married by my 35th birthday. That's in 6 months." Elijah let out a short, incredulous laugh. "And you're proposing to me? A random nurse who gave you a protein bar." "I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement," Sebastian corrected. "Your brother receives the best medical care money can buy. I fulfill the terms of my grandfather's will. After a reasonable period, we can quietly divorce with generous terms." The absurdity of the situation struck Elijah with such force that he nearly stood to leave. This had to be some elaborate prank or, worse, a test of his ethics that would cost him his job. "This is insane," he said finally. "You're asking me to commit fraud." "I'm asking you to consider a solution that solves both our problems," Sebastian countered. "Think about it. For your brother, if nothing else." Leo's face flashed in Elijah's mind, gaunt but determined. Fighting a battle his body was increasingly ill-equipped to win. The state facility Diana had mentioned would be a death sentence. "I need time," Elijah said, rising from his chair. "And assurances this isn't some twisted game." Sebastian stood as well, his height more apparent now. "Take all the time you need. My contact information is on the card. And Elijah?" His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "This isn't a game to me." 3 days later, after endless internal debate and a sleepless night researching Sebastian Thorne's business empire, Elijah found himself seated across from the billionaire at a restaurant so exclusive it didn't even have a sign on the door. "This is ridiculous," Elijah muttered, eyeing the menu with mounting horror at the prices. "I don't belong here." Sebastian glanced up from his own menu. "Would you prefer somewhere else?" The genuine question caught Elijah off guard. He'd expected Sebastian to dismiss his discomfort. "Honestly? Yes." I'd rather be somewhere where the silverware doesn't cost more than my weekly grocery budget. To his surprise, Sebastian closed his menu decisively. Then let's go. 20 minutes later, they were seated at a corner booth in Elijah's favorite diner, the plastic menus sticky from years of use. Sebastian had removed his tie and unbuttoned his collar, looking only slightly less out of place in his tailored suit. Better? Sebastian asked, scanning the laminated menu with unexpected interest. Much, Elijah admitted, watching the billionaire with growing curiosity. You don't have to slum it for my benefit, you know. Sebastian met his gaze. I'm not slumming it. I'm getting to know the man I might marry. This place matters to you, which makes it relevant to me. The waitress arrived, her eyebrows rising slightly at the odd pair they made, Elijah in his faded jeans and Henley, Sebastian in what was clearly a bespoke suit despite its casual adjustment. Their apple pie is the best in the city, Elijah offered when Sebastian hesitated over the dessert options. That apple pie it is, Sebastian decided, handing back the menu with a smile that transformed his features from merely handsome to something unexpectedly warm. Over plates of comfort food, they established the parameters of their potential arrangement. Sebastian explained the inheritance clause in detail. His grandfather, distrustful of Sebastian's commitment to anything beyond business, had stipulated marriage as proof of his ability to value something beyond corporate expansion. He was a romantic old fool, Sebastian said with surprising fondness. He believed business success without personal connection was meaningless. And you disagree? Elijah asked, studying the man across from him. Sebastian's expression turned contemplative. I used to. Now, I'm less certain. Their courtship began in earnest the following week, a carefully orchestrated series of public appearances designed to establish their relationship's credibility. Sebastian introduced Elijah to a world so removed from his daily reality that it sometimes felt like visiting another planet. At a charity gala benefiting children's cancer research, Elijah observed Sebastian in his natural habitat, charming, commanding, and utterly unreachable. He worked the room with practiced ease, his public persona as polished as his Italian leather shoes. Only occasionally did Elijah glimpse the more thoughtful man from the diner, usually when Sebastian thought no one was watching. You're different around them, Elijah noted during a quiet moment on the terrace, away from the glittering crowd inside. Sebastian swirled his champagne gently. Different how? Less real, Elijah said simply. Like you're wearing a mask. Sebastian's gaze sharpened with interest. And what makes you think the version you see is more authentic? Elijah shrugged. The Thomas I met in the ER asked real questions. He wanted to understand things, not just navigate them. For a moment, Sebastian seemed genuinely surprised by the observation. Then his expression softened into something more genuine than anything Elijah had seen all evening. Perhaps that's why I'm pursuing this particular arrangement, he said quietly. The following Saturday, Sebastian surprised Elijah by showing up at Riverstone Memorial during his shift. Dressed casually in jeans and a simple button-down, he brought coffee for the entire nursing staff and spent the afternoon observing Elijah's work with quiet attention. You're good at this, Sebastian remarked later as Elijah efficiently dressed a wound on an elderly man's arm. It's more than technical skill. You make them feel seen. Elijah glanced up, momentarily thrown by the sincerity in Sebastian's expression. That's half the healing process, being acknowledged as a person, not just a collection of symptoms. After his shift ended, Sebastian drove them to a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Leading Elijah inside, he revealed a private planetarium, a perfect dome of stars activated by Sebastian's fingerprint. You mentioned astronomy that night in the ER, Sebastian explained, watching Elijah's face as the ceiling transformed into a perfect recreation of the night sky. How do you use to stargaze with your parents before the accident? Elijah stared upward, momentarily speechless. The constellations spread out above them in breathtaking clarity, more vivid than any real sky obscured by city lights. How did you remember that? He asked finally. I barely mentioned it. Sebastian stepped closer, his voice quiet in the darkened room. I remember everything you told me that night, Elijah. Something shifted between them then, some invisible barrier thinning. When Sebastian's hand brushed against his in the darkness, Elijah didn't pull away. If we're going to make this convincing, Sebastian said, his voice lower than before, people need to believe there's something real between us. Elijah turned to face him, suddenly aware of their proximity. And how do we accomplish that? Practice, Sebastian murmured, closing the distance between them. The kiss began as performance, calculated, controlled, a logical step in their arrangement. But something unexpected happened as Sebastian's lips met his. A current of genuine response surged through Elijah, catching him off guard. Sebastian must have felt it too, because what began as demonstration deepened into exploration, his hand coming up to cradle Elijah's jaw with unexpected tenderness. When they finally broke apart, both men seemed equally startled by what had transpired. That was, Sebastian began, then stopped, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Practice, Elijah supplied, struggling to steady his breathing. Very convincing. The following week, Sebastian asked to visit Theo. Elijah hesitated, protective of his brother and wary of exposing him to their charade. But practical necessity won out. If they were to be believably engaged, Sebastian would need to know Theo. To Elijah's surprise, Sebastian arrived at the care facility without an entourage, bringing only a rare first edition of Theo's favorite science fiction novel and genuine interest in his conversation. "He's not what I expected," Theo confided after Sebastian stepped out to take a call. "What did you expect?" Elijah asked, adjusting his brother's pillows. "Someone colder? More corporate robot, less actual person." Theo studied Elijah's face carefully. "He watches you when you're not looking, like he's trying to figure you out." Before Elijah could respond, a sudden thunderclap rattled the windows. Rain began pelting the glass as Sebastian returned to the room, his expression momentarily tense at the sound. "Looks like we're in for a storm," Theo observed. Another crack of thunder made Sebastian flinch almost imperceptibly. Only Elijah, now attuned to the billionaire's subtle expressions, noticed his discomfort. Later that night at Sebastian's penthouse, as they reviewed their relationship timeline for public consumption, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sebastian's hand instinctively reached for Elijah's, gripping it tightly before he seemed to realize what he'd done. "Sorry," he said, attempting to withdraw. Elijah held on. "You're afraid of storms." It wasn't a question, but Sebastian answered anyway. "Since childhood." "Irrational, I know." "Fear rarely consults with rationality," Elijah said gently. He didn't let go of Sebastian's hand, and after a moment, Sebastian's grip relaxed from desperate to merely connected. They sat that way until the storm passed, fingers intertwined in a gesture neither man acknowledged aloud, but neither seemed willing to break. 1 month into their arrangement, Sebastian formally proposed at the opening of Nexus Technologies' new headquarters. With cameras flashing and the city's elite watching, he dropped to one knee and presented a ring that probably cost more than Elijah's yearly salary. "Elijah Novak," Sebastian said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed room. "You show me what genuine care looks like. Will you do me the honor of becoming my husband?" The words were perfectly pitched for their audience, romantic enough to seem genuine but restrained enough to match Sebastian's public persona. What the cameras couldn't capture was the silent question in Sebastian's eyes as they met Elijah's, something unscripted and unexpectedly vulnerable. Elijah's yes was meant for their audience, but the squeeze of his hand against Sebastian's as he helped him rise was something else entirely. Acknowledgement of the undercurrent now flowing beneath their carefully constructed narrative. Later that night, on the balcony of Sebastian's penthouse, they stood side by side watching the city lights. Their fingers intertwined without discussion or performance, no audience present to justify the connection. Neither man mentioned it, neither pulled away. News of their engagement spread through the media like wildfire. Tech BILLIONAIRE to we der Neures, the headlines proclaimed, spinning narratives of modern-day fairy tales and unlikely romance. Sebastian's PR team carefully managed the story, releasing selected photos of their courtship that portrayed Elijah as the humble healthcare hero who had captured the heart of one of the world's most eligible bachelors. Elijah found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never sought or wanted. Colleagues at the hospital treated him differently, some with newfound deference, others with thinly veiled suspicion. Vanessa, predictably, became insufferably ingratiating, suddenly remembering how they'd always gotten along so well. "Is it strange?" Alicia asked one evening as they changed out of their scrubs after a grueling shift. Unlike the others, she'd maintained a refreshing normalcy in their friendship. Being engaged to someone so, well, stratospheric. Elijah considered the question, wondering how much truth he could risk. "It's like existing in two parallel worlds," he admitted finally. "In one, I'm still just a nurse trying to keep people alive. In the other, I'm attending galas with people who spend more on wine than I pay in rent." And Sebastian? Is he the same person in both worlds? The question struck uncomfortably close to Elijah's private thoughts. "He's learning to be." That evening, at the penthouse Sebastian insisted was now their home, despite Elijah's reluctance to fully move in, they reviewed wedding preparations. A team of planners had transformed the spacious living room into a war room of swatches, vendor portfolios, and meticulous timelines. The guest list is at 400 now, Sebastian informed him, scanning a document on his tablet. My board members and key investors expect invitations. Elijah looked up from the sample menu he'd been absently reviewing. 400. I was thinking something smaller. Smaller isn't an option for a wedding at this level, Sebastian replied without looking up. This isn't just a personal milestone, it's a corporate and social statement. A statement about what exactly? Elijah asked, a note of challenge entering his voice. Sebastian finally met his gaze. About stability, commitment, values that reassure investors and partners. So this is a business transaction after all, Elijah said quietly. Just on a larger scale than I realized. Sebastian set down his tablet, his expression softening. Elijah, you knew what this arrangement entailed from the beginning. The marriage serves multiple purposes, including Theo's medical care. I know Elijah conceded, the mention of his brother a swift reminder of the stakes. It's just becoming more real every day. Sebastian studied him for a moment. Having second thoughts? No, Elijah replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. Just processing. Later that evening, as Sebastian took a business call in his home office, Elijah wandered the vast penthouse that still felt more like a luxury hotel than a home. In the kitchen, he found himself face to face with Lawrence, Sebastian's executive assistant, who was gathering documents Sebastian had left on the counter. Mr. Novak, Lawrence acknowledged with crisp professionalism. I was just collecting some papers for tomorrow's board meeting. Elijah nodded, reaching for a glass to pour some water. As he did, he overheard Lawrence speaking quietly on his phone. Yes, the wedding plans are proceeding on schedule. The timing couldn't be more convenient for accessing the Thorne family trust before the Osaka expansion. Elijah froze, the glass halfway to his lips. Between us, Lawrence continued, unaware of Elijah's presence just around the corner. It's brilliantly strategic. The grandfather's marriage clause satisfied, public goodwill from the unlikely romance narrative, and complete control of the trust all wrapped up in one neat package. The glass nearly slipped from Elijah's hand. He set it down carefully, backing away from the kitchen without making a sound. His chest felt tight, breathing suddenly difficult. Had he truly deluded himself into thinking their arrangement had evolved into something more? The evidence of Sebastian's calculated approach was everywhere. The carefully orchestrated public appearances, the strategic timing of their engagement announcement to coincide with Nexus's quarterly report, the wedding planned like a corporate merger rather than a personal celebration. The following day, during his shift at Riverstone, an elderly woman was admitted with congestive heart failure. As Elijah adjusted her oxygen, he noticed her watching him intently. You're him, aren't you? She asked, her voice wispy but clear. The nurse who's marrying Sebastian Thorne. Elijah smiled politely, accustomed now to such recognition. Yes, that's me. I was Margaret Thorne's nurse, she continued, Sebastian's mother, for the last 6 months of her life. Elijah's hands stilled. You knew Sebastian's mother? The woman nodded. Eleanor Prescott. I was her private nurse until she passed 5 years ago. He never mentioned you, Elijah said, pulling up a chair beside her bed, the other patients momentarily forgotten. You wouldn't have, Eleanor replied. He was in Tokyo when she died. Some important business merger. He'd been postponing his visit for weeks, always another meeting, another deal. Her expression softened with remembered sadness. She talked about him constantly, though, so proud of his success, but worried about his isolation. Isolation? Elijah echoed. After his father died when he was 12, Sebastian retreated into himself. The thunderstorms terrified him. His father's car accident happened during the worst storm in decades. Margaret said Sebastian would hide in closets during storms, counting seconds between lightning and thunder to calm himself. Eleanor's revelation echoed in Elijah's mind, the memory of Sebastian's hand instinctively seeking his during the thunderstorm. The poor boy built walls around himself, Eleanor continued. Margaret's greatest fear was that he'd never let anyone pass them. She studied Elijah with sudden intensity. That's why I was so surprised by the engagement news. You must be quite special to have broken through. Elijah felt a surge of guilt. We hadn't known each other very long. Time isn't always the most relevant factor in these matters, Eleanor said, her clinical eyes assessing him. Margaret always said what Sebastian needed was someone who'd see him, not his wealth or power. She believed that kind of authentic connection would save him from becoming as cold as his grandfather. After ensuring Eleanor was comfortable, Elijah completed his rounds in a daze, her words replaying in his mind. The Sebastian she described, the frightened boy hiding from storms, the son who prioritized business over family, the man building walls to protect himself, seemed far more complex than the calculating businessman Elijah had initially agreed to marry. That evening, as they dressed for their engagement party, Elijah watched Sebastian adjusting his cufflinks with practiced precision. Every movement efficient, every detail perfect. "Tell me about your mother," Elijah said suddenly. Sebastian's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their task. "What brought this on?" "I met someone today, Eleanor Prescott." Recognition flashed across Sebastian's face. "My mother's nurse. She said you were in Tokyo when your mother died." Sebastian turned away, focusing intently on his reflection in the mirror. "A merger that couldn't be postponed. The board was counting on me." "Did you know she was dying?" "Of course I knew," Sebastian replied, his voice carefully modulated. "The doctors gave her 3 months. She lasted 5. And you couldn't make it back for any of those 5 months." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "We're going to be late for our own engagement party." "Sebastian." "What do you want me to say, Elijah?" Sebastian turned to face him, his composure finally cracking. "That I convinced myself there would be more time. That I told myself the business couldn't survive without me, but my mother could. That I've spent 5 years knowing I made the wrong choice." The raw pain in his voice stunned Elijah into silence. Sebastian adjusted his tie with fingers that weren't quite steady. "We should go. 400 of our closest friends and business associates are waiting." The engagement party was held at the Thorne family estate, a sprawling mansion that had been in Sebastian's family for generations. Crystal chandeliers illuminated rooms filled with the elite of business and society, all gathered to celebrate the union of Sebastian Thorne and his unexpected choice of partner. Elijah moved through the crowds in a designer suit that fit him perfectly but still felt like a costume. He'd lost track of Sebastian an hour ago, swept away by board members eager to discuss the upcoming Osaka expansion. "He certainly trades up quickly," a cultured voice remarked behind him. Elijah turned to find himself face to face with a striking man in his early 30s, impeccably dressed and radiating the same effortless confidence as Sebastian. "Archer Hamilton," the man introduced himself, extending a manicured hand. "Sebastian and I were quite close until about, 6 months ago. Right around when he started his little social experiment, as he calls it." Elijah had accepted the handshake automatically, recognition dawning. "You're Sebastian's ex-partner, ex-CFO, ex-many things," Archer confirmed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I must say, when Sebastian confided his plan to find someone suitable for his grandfather's marriage clause, I never expected he'd choose quite so far outside our circle." Elijah's blood ran cold. "When did he confide this plan?" "Just before we parted ways," Archer replied, sipping his champagne. "He was quite methodical about it. Spreadsheets analyzing potential candidates, cost-benefit analysis of various approaches. He studied Elijah with clinical interest. The homeless disguise was a stroke of genius, though. Much more organic way to identify suitable candidates than the corporate recruitment process he'd initially considered." The room seemed to tilt around Elijah. "Excuse me," he managed, setting down his untouched champagne. He found his way to a terrace, gulping the cool night air, trying to process Archer's revelation. Had everything been orchestrated from the beginning? The social experiment, the chance meeting, the convenient solution to both their problems. "Elijah?" Sebastian's voice came from behind him. "The photographer wants some shots of us together." Elijah turned, seeing Sebastian as if for the first time, the perfect suit, the carefully cultivated image, the calculated public persona. "Was any of it real?" he asked quietly. Sebastian's expression shifted from confusion to wariness. "What are you talking about?" "Archer told me about your plan. The spreadsheets analyzing potential marriage candidates. The social experiment designed to find someone suitable." Each word felt like glass in his throat. "Was that just the most cost-effective solution you found?" "Archer," Sebastian repeated, understanding dawning. "Whatever he told you." "Just tell me the truth," Elijah interrupted. "For once." Sebastian's silence was answer enough. "I need to go," Elijah said, moving past him toward the door. "Elijah, wait." Sebastian reached for his arm. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" "That you've been manipulating me from the beginning. That this whole relationship is based on an elaborate lie." Elijah pulled away. "I knew this was an arrangement, Sebastian. I understood the transactional nature. What I didn't realize was that even the meeting itself was staged. Not everything was calculated, Sebastian insisted. Things changed. Did they? Elijah challenged. Or am I just playing the role you selected me for, fulfilling the requirements of your grandfather's will while generating positive PR for your company? That's not fair. No, what's not fair is making me believe there might be something genuine growing between us when this was all just another business strategy. Elijah left without waiting for Sebastian's response, ignoring the curious glances of party guests as he made his way through the crowd. He found a taxi outside the estate gates and gave the driver the address of his own apartment, the place he'd barely visited in weeks, the home he'd nearly forgotten in the whirlwind of Sebastian's world. The apartment was cold and dusty, bills still stacked on the counter where he'd left them. Sitting on his worn sofa, Elijah stared at the engagement ring still on his finger, platinum and sapphire, chosen because Sebastian had said it matched his eyes. Even that detail had probably been focus grouped for maximum romantic appeal. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Sebastian, each one left unanswered. Around midnight, a final text came through. Regardless of what you believe about us, my commitment to Theo's care remains unconditional. That was never part of any strategy. The message only twisted the knife deeper. Even Sebastian's apparent kindness circled back to financial support, the one thing the billionaire believed could solve any problem. Rain began to fall outside, tapping against the windows in a rhythm that mimicked the ache in Elijah's chest. He wondered if Sebastian was counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, alone in his perfect penthouse with all the wealth in the world, and no one to hold his hand through the storm. 3 days after the disastrous engagement party, Elijah was back at work, immersing himself in the familiar rhythm of the emergency room. The mindless routine of checking vitals, administering medications, and updating charts provided temporary respite from the chaos of his personal life. Here, identities were clear. He was a nurse, his patients needed care, and the roles never blurred into something unrecognizable. He'd ignored 17 calls from Sebastian and twice that many text messages. His engagement ring sat in a drawer at his apartment, the absence on his finger drawing curious glances from colleagues who'd grown accustomed to its sparkle. Trouble in paradise, Vanessa asked during a rare quiet moment at the nurse's station, her tone suggesting she'd been waiting for this opportunity. Not now, Vanessa, Elijah replied, focusing intently on the chart before him. Just saying it was always a bit fairy tale, wasn't it? The nurse and the billionaire. She leaned closer, dropping her voice. Some of us had a betting pool on how long it would last. I had 6 months, but looks like I was optimistic. Something in Elijah snapped. Is that how you see patients too? Just stereotypes to be dismissed based on appearances. The homeless don't deserve dignity. The wealthy can't feel pain. He slammed the chart shut. Maybe the reason you're so quick to judge others is because you're terrified of anyone looking closely enough to see you. Vanessa recoiled as if slapped, genuine shock registering on her face. I apologize, Elijah said immediately, the nurse in him horrified at his own outburst. That was unprofessional. He retreated to the supply closet, leaning against shelves of gauze and antiseptic, trying to regain his composure. His own words echoed uncomfortably in his mind. Hadn't he done exactly what he'd accused Vanessa of doing? Judged Sebastian through the lens of stereotype rather than seeing the complex person beneath? Elijah? Alicia's voice came from the doorway. You okay? Just needed a minute, he replied, straightening and reaching for a box of gloves to justify his presence. I heard what happened with Vanessa. Alicia stepped inside, closing the door partway. She had it coming, but that's not like you. Elijah sighed. Nothing feels like me anymore. Want to talk about it? Not particularly. Alicia studied him for a moment. You know, Sebastian's been volunteering at the free clinic downstairs. Elijah stilled. What? For about 2 weeks now. Not as a medical professional, obviously, but helping with intake, paperwork, getting people registered for assistance programs. She watched his reaction carefully. He's using his real name, not hiding who he is. The press would have a field day if they knew. Why would he do that? He told Dr. Chen he wanted to understand the system from the inside to see what improvements could be made. Alicia paused. He's also been implementing changes to our ER based on feedback he collected during his homeless experience. New privacy measures, streamlined intake for uninsured patients, a dignity protocol for those who can't pay. Elijah felt as if the floor was shifting beneath him. I didn't know. He didn't want you to. Alicia opened the door fully. Room 4 needs vitals checked when you're ready. The rest of Elijah's shift passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. As he treated each patient, he found himself looking more carefully at their faces, their expressions, the unspoken stories behind their symptoms. Exactly what he'd done with Thomas that first night, before knowing who he really was. Hadn't been so quick to assume the worst of Sebastian because it was easier than admitting his own fear. Fear that something real was developing between them, something that transcended their arrangement and threatened the careful boundaries he'd established. When his shift ended at midnight, Elijah found himself driving not to his apartment, but to the cemetery on the outskirts of the city. He wasn't entirely sure why until he crested the hill and saw a solitary figure standing before a marble headstone, illuminated by moonlight. Sebastian's shoulders were hunched against the cold, his normally perfect posture abandoned in private grief. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the certainty that typically radiated from him in public. Elijah approached quietly, stopping several feet away. "Your mother." Sebastian didn't turn, didn't startle at his voice. Perhaps he'd known that Elijah was there all along. Margaret Elizabeth Thorne. She loved gardenias and mystery novels, hated pretension, could always tell when I was lying, even over the phone. Elijah moved closer, reading the dates on the elegant headstone. She was young. 52, pancreatic cancer. Sebastian's voice was flat, disconnected. By the time they found it, it had already metastasized. The oncologist gave her 3 months. I told her I'd clear my schedule, be with her through the treatments. But he didn't, Elijah said softly, not an accusation, but an acknowledgement. The Tokyo merger was supposed to take 2 weeks. It dragged into 6. Every time I planned to leave, another crisis emerged that only I could handle. Sebastian's bitter laugh held no humor. The great Sebastian Thorne, master of global telecommunications, couldn't manage to be present for the one call that mattered most. They stood in silence, the night air crisp around them. "Why did you really do it?" Elijah asked finally. "The homeless disguise. Was it all just to find someone suitable for your grandfather's clause?" Sebastian was quiet for so long that Elijah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its practiced smoothness. "My mother's last coherent words were about a nurse who'd shown her extraordinary kindness during her final days. Someone who'd treated her like a person, not just a collection of failing organs. She said the kind of genuine compassion was what I needed in my life." He turned to face Elijah fully. I wanted to understand what she meant. The simple truth of it struck Elijah with unexpected force. "So you put yourself in a position of vulnerability." "Extreme vulnerability," Sebastian corrected. "When you're perceived as wealthy, people treat you differently. They see opportunity, not humanity. As Thomas, I was invisible. Except to you." "I was just doing my job," Elijah said automatically. "No, you weren't." Sebastian's certainty was absolute. "You went beyond protocol. You saw me when no one else bothered to look." The echo of Eleanor's words about Sebastian's mother sent a chill through Elijah. "Your mother's nurse told me something similar, about you needing someone who would see you, not your wealth." "Eleanor," Sebastian nodded. "She tried to get me to come home when Mother took a turn for the worse. I told her I'd be there in 3 days." His voice tightened. "She died that night?" Elijah felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of compassion for the man before him. Not the billionaire CEO, but the grieving son still haunted by his absence during his mother's final moments. "The foundation wasn't in my original plan," Sebastian continued. "Mather was falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, stark and unadorned by the usual polish of Sebastian's speech. "What foundation?" Elijah asked, focusing on the safer part of Sebastian's statement. "The Margaret Thorne Foundation for Universal Care. I'm announcing it next week. It will provide comprehensive coverage for patients without insurance, starting with a dedicated wing at Riverstone." Sebastian looked back at his mother's grave. "It's named after your parents too, in spirit. The nurses who showed you what compassion looked like in the darkness." Elijah felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted again. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted it to be more than a gesture to win you back. I needed to make actual changes, not just promises." Sebastian's smile was sad. "I've been learning from you, Elijah. Actions matter more than words or money." Before Elijah could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the care facility where Theo lived. His heart dropped as he answered. "Mr. Novak, it's Diana Evans. You need to come right away." Theo's had a setback. He's being transferred to Riverstone's IQ. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of sirens and flashing lights. Sebastian had insisted on driving, his usual controlled demeanor replaced by focused intensity as he maneuvered through traffic with surprising skill. At the hospital, they found Theo already hooked to machines, his normally animated face pale and still. Dr. Sanders was reviewing his chart when they arrived. Acute respiratory distress, he explained. We've stabilized him for now, but his immune system is severely compromised. The next 24 hours are critical. Elijah sank into the chair beside his brother's bed, taking Theo's limp hand in his own. Sebastian remained standing at the foot of the bed, his face unreadable. "I'll get you some coffee," he said finally, "and call Dr. Weiss from Boston General. She's the leading specialist in autoimmune complications." Hours passed in the limbo of the ICU, marked only by the steady beep of monitors and the hushed footsteps of medical staff. Sebastian didn't leave, didn't retreat to his office or his penthouse to manage his empire remotely. Instead, he occupied the uncomfortable chair on the other side of Theo's bed, his jacket long discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up, as if preparing for work that required more than money or influence. When Elijah finally succumbed to exhaustion around dawn, he woke an hour later to find Sebastian still there, reading aloud softly from Theo's favorite science fiction novel, the rare first edition he'd given him weeks earlier. "You stayed," Elijah said, his voice rough with sleep. Sebastian looked up from the book. "Of course I stayed." Those three simple words contained multitudes, an acknowledgement of past failures, a promise of present commitment, a glimpse of a future where priorities had shifted. Dr. Weiss arrived from Boston that afternoon, a formidable woman whose reputation was matched only by her efficiency. After examining Theo and consulting with the Riverstone team, she presented a treatment plan that offered genuine hope rather than just borrowed time. "The protocol is experimental," she cautioned, "but the preliminary results are promising. With his current condition, I believe Theo is an excellent candidate." "Whatever it costs," Sebastian began. "It's not about cost, Mr. Thorne," Dr. Weiss interrupted. "It's about compatibility and commitment to the rigorous recovery process." "He has both," Elijah said firmly, meeting his brother's eyes as Theo regained consciousness enough to participate in the decision. "We do this together, Theo." For the next 3 days, Elijah barely left the hospital. Sebastian came and went as necessary but always returned, bringing food that Elijah would forget to eat, handling calls to Elijah's supervisor to arrange extended leave, and somehow managing his own corporate responsibilities in the margins of their crisis. On the 4th day, with Theo officially stabilized and responding well to the initial treatment, Elijah found Sebastian in the hospital chapel, sitting alone in the dim light. "I didn't know you were religious," Elijah said, sliding into the pew beside him. "I'm not," Sebastian replied, "but it's quiet here. Good for thinking." "About what?" "About what matters." Sebastian turned to face him. "When my mother was dying, I convinced myself that my company needed me more than she did. That the thousands of employees and millions of users depending on Nexus's success justified my absence from one bedside." He shook his head. "I was wrong." Elijah studied the man beside him, the shadows under his eyes, the wrinkled shirt, the 5 o'clock shadow that would never appear in any of his carefully curated public photos. "I heard what Archer told you at the party," Sebastian continued, "about the spreadsheets and the strategic planning." "Was it true?" Elijah asked, needing to hear the confirmation directly. "Partially. I did analyze potential candidates for a marriage of convenience. I did plan the social experiment to understand healthcare from a different perspective." Sebastian met his gaze directly. "What I didn't plan was you, Elijah. The way you dismantle every calculation and strategy just by being exactly who you are." "And who am I?" Elijah asked. "The man who reminded me that seeing people, truly seeing them, is what makes us human." Sebastian reached for Elijah's hand tentatively. "I've never felt more authentic than when I'm with you, whether disguised as Thomas or standing in the spotlight as Sebastian Thorne." Elijah looked down at their joined hands. "I don't know if I can trust this. Us." "I know," Sebastian replied. "Trust requires evidence sustained over time. I can only ask for the chance to provide that evidence." His voice dropped, becoming something raw and unguarded. "I love you, Elijah. Not as part of any strategy or arrangement, just as the simple, terrifying truth." The words hung between them, stripped of calculation or performance, just honest vulnerability from a man who had built his life around control and certainty. "I need time," Elijah said finally, "and so does Theo." "You have both," Sebastian promised, "for as long as necessary." As spring blossomed across the city, Theo's health improved steadily under Dr. Weiss's experimental protocol. The treatment wasn't without difficulties. There were days of fevers and setbacks that left Elijah pacing hospital corridors, But for the first time in years, hope wasn't just a word they used to comfort each other. It had substance, backed by improving test results and Theo's gradually returning strength. Sebastian kept his promise of time and space, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring that every medical need was met without question or fanfare. He never used his financial support as leverage, never mentioned their suspended engagement, never pressured Elijah for decisions about their future. Instead, he focused on actions, establishing the Margaret Thorne Foundation with an initial endowment that made headlines across the healthcare industry, stepping back from day-to-day operations at Nexus to focus on the foundation's development, continuing his volunteer work at the free clinic despite the occasional paparazzi that discovered his presence. Elijah watched these changes from a careful distance, neither fully reconnected nor completely separated. They spoke regularly about Theo's care, occasionally shared meals in the hospital cafeteria, and gradually rebuilt something that resembled trust, if not yet the intimacy they'd begun to discover before everything fractured. 1 month before the date that would have been their wedding, Sebastian's family lawyer arrived unannounced at the private rehab facility, where Theo was now receiving physical therapy. Elijah was helping his brother with stretching exercises when the lawyer appeared in the doorway, his tailored suit and imperious manner immediately setting Elijah on edge. "Mr. Novak," the lawyer said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I'm Edward Harrington, representing the Thorne family interests. Could we speak privately?" Theo raised an eyebrow at Elijah, who squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of my brother." Harrington's lips thinned with disapproval, but he removed a document from his leather portfolio. "I've prepared a prenuptial agreement regarding your upcoming marriage to Sebastian Thorne. Given the substantial disparity in assets, the family believes this is prudent." Elijah stared at the document in disbelief. "There is no upcoming marriage." "Mr. Thorne has indicated otherwise," Harrington replied smoothly. "The date specified in this agreement is June 17th, which I understand was your originally planned wedding date." "Sebastian and I aren't together anymore," Elijah said slowly, trying to process this bizarre development. "We hadn't discussed resuming our engagement, let alone setting a wedding date." Harrington's expression remained impassive. "Nevertheless, this agreement requires your signature before any ceremony can proceed. It stipulates that in the event of divorce, you would receive a one-time settlement of $5 million, but no ongoing support or access to Thorne family holdings." Theo let out a low whistle. $5 million is generous by normal standards, but pretty insulting given Sebastian's net worth. "The amount reflects the brief nature of your association," Harrington explained, as if discussing the weather rather than Elijah's life. Mr. Thorne's grandfather was quite specific about protecting the family trust from opportunistic connections. The implied insult made Elijah's cheeks burn. "I think you should leave. I need your signature, Mr. Novak." "You need to leave," Elijah repeated, his voice hardening. "Now." Harrington placed the document on a nearby table. "Review it at your convenience. My contact information is on the last page." After the lawyer departed, Theo turned to Elijah with wide eyes. "What was that about? Are you and Sebastian secretly back together?" "Absolutely not," Elijah replied, staring at the document as if it might bite. "This makes no sense." That evening, Elijah arrived at Sebastian's penthouse unannounced, the prenuptial agreement tucked under his arm. The security staff recognized him immediately, ushering him up without question despite the months since his last visit. Sebastian was at his desk when Elijah entered, his attention focused on his laptop screen. He looked up in surprise, rising immediately. "Elijah, is everything all right? Is Theo?" "Your family lawyer visited us today," Elijah interrupted, tossing the print up onto the desk. "Care to explain?" Sebastian's expression shifted from confusion to cold fury as he scanned the document. "Harrington did this without my knowledge or authorization. He said you'd set a wedding date, our original date. That's not true." Sebastian picked up his phone, dialing with controlled anger. "Harrington, my office, immediately." He disconnected without waiting for a response. "You didn't request this?" Elijah asked, still uncertain. "I would never." Sebastian's voice was tight with controlled rage. "This document violates everything I believe about our relationship, everything I've been trying to prove to you these past months." Elijah studied his face, searching for any hint of deception and finding none. "Why would your lawyer do this independently?" "Because my grandfather's trustee is pressuring the family. The deadline for my marriage requirement is approaching, and without it, certain holdings revert to my uncle's control." Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of genuine frustration. Harrington likely assumed he was protecting family interests. The explanation made logical sense, but something still nagged at Elijah. So you haven't decided to trigger the marriage clause another way? Find someone else who fits the requirements. There is no one else, Sebastian said simply. I don't want the marriage clause satisfied by an arrangement with a stranger. Either it's you, because we both want it beyond any financial considerations, or I'll let the holdings go. The quiet certainty in his voice struck Elijah deeply. You give up millions because of principle. I give up millions because money is replaceable. You aren't. Sebastian moved around the desk but maintained a respectful distance. I know I haven't earned back your trust yet. I know I may never fully deserve it. But I meant what I said in that chapel, Elijah. I love you. Not for what you represent or what you satisfy in legal terms, but for who you are. Elijah looked at the man before him, not the billionaire CEO or the strategic mastermind, but simply Sebastian, with all his flaws and strengths laid bare. I'm scared, Elijah admitted quietly. Of what? Of believing in this, in us, in the possibility that something that began as a transaction could transform into something genuine. Elijah's voice wavered slightly. What if we're both just convincing ourselves that this is real because it's convenient? Sebastian didn't immediately counter with reassurances. Instead, he considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think, he said finally, that real connections can grow from unexpected beginnings. I think we both changed in ways neither of us anticipated. And I think the only way to know if this is genuine is to remove the transaction entirely from the equation. Harrington arrived 20 minutes later, striding into Sebastian's office with the confident air of a man whose judgment was beyond reproach. His confidence evaporated when he saw Elijah and the prenuptial agreement on the desk. Mr. Thorne, I took the liberty off. You took liberties you had no right to take, Sebastian cut him off coldly. You approached Mr. Novak without my authorization, presented a document I never approved, and made representations about our relationship that were not yours to make. Harrington's composure cracked slightly. The trustees are concerned about the deadline. Without the marriage, the Osaka expansion. We'll proceed with alternative financing if necessary, Sebastian finished. Your services are no longer required, Edward. The firm will receive formal notification tomorrow. Please leave your security credentials with reception on your way out. After Harrington's stunned departure, silence settled between Elijah and Sebastian. You didn't have to fire him, Elijah said finally. Yes, I did, Sebastian replied without hesitation. Not just for approaching you, but for believing I would ever agree to those terms. For assuming my priorities haven't changed. The evening before what would have been their wedding day, Elijah stood on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. The weight of indecision pressed heavily on him. Despite everything, Sebastian's consistent actions over words, his willingness to sacrifice the inheritance for principle, his patient respect for Elijah's boundaries, doubts still lingered. What if they were fooling themselves? What if the fundamental differences in their worlds eventually pulled them apart? What if Elijah lost his identity in Sebastian's orbit? What if Sebastian grew to resent supporting Theo? His phone buzzed with a text from Alicia, still overthinking everything. Elijah smiled despite himself, typing back, How did you know? Because you're you. For what it's worth, I've watched that man volunteering at the clinic for months now. Nobody maintains that level of commitment just for show. Her words resonated with something Eleanor had told him months ago about time not always being the most relevant factor in relationships. Perhaps what mattered wasn't how they began, but what they'd become, two people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and remained. The next morning, Elijah found himself driving to Riverstone Memorial, not to work a shift, but following some instinct he couldn't quite articulate. He walked through the ER doors, past the nurse's station where Vanessa offered a surprisingly genuine smile, and down the corridor where he'd first met Thomas all those months ago. He wasn't entirely surprised to find Sebastian there, sitting on the same bench where they'd first talked about astronomy, dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in the worn jeans and simple shirt he'd worn as Thomas. His beard was neatly trimmed rather than unkempt, but there was something of that first night in his quiet presence, his watchful eyes. What are you doing here? Elijah asked, though he suspected he already knew. Sebastian looked up with a small smile, remembering where I first felt seen. Elijah sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Today was supposed to be our wedding day. Yes. You let it go. The inheritance clause. Sebastian nodded. The trustees are furious. My uncle is ecstatic. The board is nervous, but managing. And you? I'm right where I need to be. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the controlled chaos of the ER around them. Nurses moving efficiently between rooms, doctors reviewing charts, family members anxiously waiting for news. I've been thinking about appearances, Elijah said finally. How they both reveal and conceal. How they can be masks we hide behind or windows into who we really are. Sebastian listened attentively, giving him space to find his words. When you were Thomas, certain parts of you were hidden, but others were more visible than ever, Elijah continued. And when you're Sebastian Thorne, billionaire CEO, different parts are hidden and revealed. But underneath it all, there's just you. The man who's afraid of thunderstorms. The son who still grieves his mother. The person who remembers offhand comments about astronomy. And sees that as more valuable than merger strategies, Sebastian added softly. That's the man I fell in love with, Elijah said, the words finally finding honest voice. Not because of what you can provide, but because of who you are when all the external trappings fall away. Sebastian's eyes widened slightly. Are you saying? I'm saying I want to try it, Elijah clarified. Not an arrangement, not a transaction. Just us figuring out if what we feel is strong enough to bridge our differences. That's all I've wanted, Sebastian replied, his voice rough with emotion. Just the chance to love you without conditions or expectations. I have conditions, Elijah corrected with a small smile. No 400-person wedding, no media coverage, no prenups written by family lawyers. Agreed on all counts, Sebastian said immediately. Anything else? Yes. You need to step back into your role at Nexus. Sebastian looked surprised. But the foundation? We'll manage the foundation together, Elijah said. But you built something important at Nexus. Your employees and users need your vision, just with better boundaries this time. Together, Sebastian repeated, savoring the word. I like the sound of that. 2 months later, they were married in the hospital chapel with only Theo, Dr. Weiss, Alicia, and a handful of others in attendance. No photographers, no press release, no corporate agenda. Sebastian wore a simple suit, Elijah a blue shirt that matched his eyes. Their vows referenced their unusual beginning and the authentic love that had grown from it against all odds. When they emerged from the chapel, Sebastian led Elijah to the hospital roof where they could see the city spread out before them. Elijah's world of service and care integrated with Sebastian's world of innovation and influence, no longer separate realms but complementary facets of the life they were building together. Look, Sebastian said, pointing to the hospital's east wing where construction was underway. The Novak Thorne Center for Universal Care, opening next spring. Elijah leaned against him, their fingers intertwined as naturally as breathing now. What happens when appearance and reality align? He asked softly. Sebastian smiled, pressing a kiss to his temple. Then you have the truth, and that's the only thing worth building a life on. Above them, stars emerged as twilight deepened. The same constellations they had observed in the planetarium during their first kiss, now visible through the city's haze as a reminder that sometimes beauty reveals itself only to those patient enough to look beyond initial appearances.